and welcome back to another edition of the Need to Know series here at Ukie. And today we have Johnston Carmichael, who's joining us to talk about hiring from a global talent pool. And I'd like to introduce our guest today. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yes, I'll go first. I'm Amanda.Collinson, and I'm a tax director at Johnston Carmichael, and I specialise in advising companies on international tax considerations if they're expanding overseas or setting up new companies in another country.
Hi, I'm Jane.OBerg. I'm also a tax director at Johnston Carmichael, and my specialism is global mobility. So working with companies who have cross-border employees or self-employed contractors, helping them identify and navigate the employer obligations that come out of those situations.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thinking about your clients, what trends are you seeing? What trends are coming out in terms of hiring?
So I can take this one, Amanda. We've seen a big shift predominantly since the pandemic. So if we think back to that time, almost 4 years ago now, when we were all sent home and we were working 100% remotely, that was a big change and a big shift in working arrangements that we'd seen. Coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing those same trends shift to that kind of working pattern now. So from an employee perspective, they still want that flexibility of working remotely, whether that fits in with their home life, whether that you get rid of the commute, whether they're just more productive at home. But from an employer perspective, we are seeing the trend that they are now more open to hiring people overseas, or not necessarily based on physicality and location, much more based on skill set and where that talent lies. So we are seeing a shift now. The client queries that we're seeing is shifting towards hiring from a wider pool of people overseas, not necessarily in a location where they have an existing entity. So yeah, we have seen that shift come more and more since we've come through the pandemic.
And has there been a different approach with small companies versus large companies?
I think the approach is the options are the same, but maybe the outcome is slightly different based on size of entity that we're dealing with. So when you're looking to hire overseas and hire an international remote worker, the options are available to you the same regardless of size. So we talk to clients about the options available being you can hire that individual based on the UK entity. There's an option available to you what's called an employer of record company. I don't know whether your members have heard of those before, but there's a lot of those in the market at the moment that basically look to take all of your employee obligations away from you, or to a certain extent, for a fee. So that's an option that's available. Other options available to you that we deal with more, and this is Amanda's bag, is that more with the larger groups, is that they may already have a subsidiary over in that location, or have more overseas entities out there. So the options are the same. It's just based on what fits for the size of entity. And that might come down to internal resources. It might come down to funding available at that moment in time. It might come down to the internal risk barometer of that company in question. So those are all the different approaches. I don't know, Amanda, whether you want to add on to that from a corporate perspective.
Yeah, so as you said, with a larger group or a larger company with more employees, they might be more likely to think about setting up a registered branch in another country or a subsidiary in another country, so a separate legal entity. If, for example, they'd identified there was a good talent pool in a particular country, so perhaps I know a couple of companies that have a lot of developers in Spain, for example, so they might think, well, there's a good talent pool, so we'll actually set up a separate company in order to hire those people and have them based there. Whereas with smaller groups or groups just starting out on this journey, where they're just looking to hire one person in a location, they're less likely to go to that extent, because setting up a company or registering a branch comes with some compliance costs. You have to obviously register and keep up to date with filings in that jurisdiction. So that's probably the main difference that we're seeing.
And obviously, this is your area. What are the main tax considerations if a company decides to hire someone outside the UK? What do they need to think about?
So we do have what we call our 5-point checklist, Amanda, that we run through with our different client queries, and the areas for consideration will be the same regardless of the query. The differences come about by the actual outcome or the solutions, and that's very much dependent upon the individual employee and their personal circumstances, but also the country combination that you've got, where the employing entity is, and where the individual is physically located. So first and foremost is the immigration perspective. So when we came out of the pandemic, the UK had also left the EU, which was two very different. We were therefore dealing in a very different market environment. So immigration now, I would say, is the key priority for companies when you're thinking about hiring somebody in an overseas location, or you have employees moving across the world. Just check the immigration of that individual and that they have the right to work in that location that you're looking to employ. The second, more or less, whether you have an employer obligation in that location. So just because you may not have an overseas entity physically based in that location where the individual employee is going to be based, does not mean that you don't have an employer obligation. Now, as is all the case with tax questions, it really is dependent upon the country where we're going to. There's no one size fits all, and every location and every jurisdiction will have their own domestic legislation that we need to look at. The questions that you need to be thinking about are, do I have to operate a payroll to withhold payroll taxes? And is there a social security or a national insurance liability for both employer and employee? So those are the kinds of considerations that we need to think about for employer obligations. The other point from my perspective is the employment law. So if you're thinking of engaging somebody based on a UK employment contract, so you're a UK entity, you don't have any other subsidiaries, you've discarded the employer of record option, and you want to engage solely with that individual based in Spain, for example, as a UK employee, you need to think about the employment contract that's in place and whether it's fit for purpose over in Spain, for example. Then Spain, or that whatever location you're in, may have mandatory benefits that you have to provide to that individual employee. They may require a salary payment from an in-country bank account. But on the flip side, if you have a UK employment contract, that individual, we offer auto enrolment in the UK, that individual may not be eligible to enroll in the UK pension scheme. So are you going to think about alternative methods of compensation because you can't provide that benefit? So all encompassing in the employment law, I would suggest you get an employment lawyer to look at that employment contract just to make sure it's fit for purpose. And then before I pass on to Amanda from the corporate side, the other point that I would pick up on is if you have an international remote worker, you've hired this person in an outside location, but they are employed by the UK entity. Will they be coming back to the UK for any work purposes? So will you have them back for catch-up meetings once a quarter, every other month, for example? Because that will have UK employer withholding obligations here in the UK. So it's very much about looking at the interaction between whether there's a UK employer obligation, whether there's an overseas employer obligation, and how you navigate that for cash flow for the employer, but also for the employee.
So let's just clarify on that. So even if they're just coming back for one meeting in like once a quarter, that triggers the UK side?
If they are on a UK employment contract. So if you decide to employ them by the UK entity and they come back for a meeting, for example, one day,
just be one day,
a week, because the costs sit in the UK and the legal employer is in the UK, then the UK employer will have a withholding obligation for that individual. There are agreements we can talk to the revenue about to minimise the pay as you earn withholding, so it's not on 100% of the employment income. But this is where that proactive planning comes into play, because if you know that in advance, we can plan it to mitigate any cash flow disadvantage both for employer and employee.
Fantastic. Amanda?
And so the corporate tax point to pick up on there is, even if you're just hiring even just one person, but if you're hiring someone in another country, that could lead to your UK company having a corporate tax filing obligation or tax liability to pay in that other country. So even if you haven't set up a subsidiary, and maybe you haven't chosen to register a branch formally, having employees, one or several people on the ground, can trigger that tax liability from a corporate perspective as well. And that the sort of technical term often used is permanent establishment. So you could have a permanent establishment in another country. And I think the things to think about there are thinking about what that individual does. So what is their role? And there would be a difference in terms of risk from if you're hiring maybe someone more junior, or maybe someone who's sort of carrying out regular day-to-day work, but not in charge of making strategic decisions or management decisions. So that type of role is likely to come with less risk of creating a permanent establishment compared to a more senior managerial role or someone with very specialist skills that is essential to your business. They're carrying out a really key role. That's more likely to come with a higher risk that you could have a corporate tax liability through a permanent establishment in the other country. So that's a key one to be aware of when you're thinking about hiring. What level is that person, and if they are senior and if they can make decisions or go out winning new work for you for the business, then it's time to take some tax advice there to check on that level of risk. And again, it would depend on that country, the other country you're in. What are their rules? How do they view it? But you would be best taking advice up front rather than finding out a few years down the line, that you should have been filing.
Brilliant. There's so much to think about, but thank you for providing a sort of overview of the potential things to think about and what might come up. But let's think about it the other way. Why have you had a British national who, the rise of digital nomad and those kind of lives since COVID? What do you need to think about if they need to work in another country for a short or long period of time?
Do you want to go, Jane?
Yeah, I think the areas for consideration from a compliance and tax perspective are the same. So we would call these work from anywhere as opposed to you're hiring from anywhere. So the international remote worker from a fresh we would term that hire from anywhere. If you receive such a request for an individual current employee who wants to work from anywhere, the risks are the same. The areas for consideration are the same. I would say more prominently the immigration perspective, if they've got, particularly if you have a UK national wanting to go and work overseas. So I would say the risks are the same, and what we've discussed previously. What I would then talk to clients about is the people element or the softer element in terms of what's the driver for this move. Why does an individual and the length of time they want to go over there for, or to go to the jurisdiction that they want to go to for? Be careful not to set inadvertently a precedent. So if you're going to say yes to somebody, make sure that you're not setting yourself up for further requests that might not necessarily follow the same fact pattern, but you just don't want to set an inadvertent precedent for your employee population. I'd also talk to them about the internal risk factor. So are they taking your equipment out to this location, and have you got any IT risks or legality risks there? Will your current insurance cover the individual where they're working overseas? The health and safety element, the safety questionnaires that we have to fill in anyway when you're working in an office, those kind of questions still need to be applied to your remote workers. So it might be harder to figure that out and just get get yourself comfortable that they are in a appropriate environment to work with. Then the other bit that we talk to clients quite a lot about is the employee welfare and the training element. So if they want to go and work in another location, what's the time difference? What's their support network over there? What you're going to do about teaming and building those bonds and rapport between your teams on the ground and your team remotely? What about training? Do you have internal training? Do they learn on the job? How's that going to work? And these are all questions that are asked, but the answers very much depend on the duration that individual requesting to work overseas for. And those are like the people areas that tend to get forgotten about, but are just as important, if not more so, than the compliance obligations. That's what the discussions that we're seeing, Amanda. I don't know whether you want to add in as well.
I think from a corporate tax perspective, it's the same risk as mentioned earlier, where if you're hiring locally or if someone's moving. So again, you'd have to review the level of seniority there. But absolutely agree that it's not the compliance and the tax actually is not the critical factor here. Really, it's that people element and the team element. How will that impact your team if you have people working in different locations, and how are you going to continue to work closely together and collaborate in that setup? I think that's probably the first question for the business. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today to talk about hiring remotely. Hiring global talent, I should say. Thank you to Amanda and Jane for Johnston Carmichael. How can people get in touch with you and find you if they want to speak a little bit more on this subject?
We've got we contactable straight away through the Johnston Carmichael website. If you click on the International Insights page, it takes you straight through to both Amanda and myself, and our contact details are on the website there, or follow us on LinkedIn.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, there's another video here if you'd like to watch more in this series, and don't forget to like and subscribe here at YouTube to watch more videos from Ukie. Thank you very much.